The lottery. The morning of June 27th is a clear, warm summer day. There are many colorful flowers, and the grass is beautiful and green. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the people of the village begin to arrive in the town square, located between the post office and the bank. In some towns, there are so many people that the lottery takes 2 days and must be started on June 26th. But in this village, there are only about 300 people, and the whole lottery takes less than 2 hours. So, it can begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and end in time for the villagers to go home for noon lunch. The children arrive first, of course. Summer is just beginning, and the children do not have to go to school. The feeling of liberty is still new for most of them. They tend to stay together quietly in small groups for a time before they run and play loudly, and they still talk about school and the teacher, books, and punishments. Bobby Martin already has many rocks in his pockets, and the other boys copy his example, choosing the best stones, the ones that fit perfectly in their hands. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix. The people in the town pronounce his name Delacroix, make a very large pile of stones in one corner of the square, and defend it from the attacks of the other boys. The girls stand away from the boys, talking to each other, pretending not to look at the boys, and the very small children play in the dirt or hold the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men begin to arrive, watching their own children. They talk to each other about planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stand together, away from the pile of stones in the corner of the square. Their jokes are quiet and they smile, they do not laugh. The women arrive soon after their husbands. They are wearing the old dresses and sweaters they normally wear at home. They say hello to each other and tell each other stories of gossip before they go to their husbands. Soon the women, standing next to their husbands, begin to call their children. The children come reluctantly. The mothers have to call them 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin runs away from his mother, back to the pile of stones, laughing. His father speaks severely to him, and Bobby comes back quickly and stands in the correct place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery is organized by Mr. Summers. He also organizes the town dances, the teenage club, and the Halloween program. He has the time and energy to devote to the town activities. He is a jovial man with a round face. He operates the coal company. People feel sorry for him because he does not have any children and his wife often treats him badly. When he arrives in the square, he is carrying a black box made of wood. People begin to talk as he arrives. Mr. Summers waves and says, "I'm sorry I'm a little late today, everyone." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, follows him. He is carrying a stool with 3 legs. He puts the stool in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers puts the black box on it. The villagers stay far away from the stool. When Mr. Summers asks, "Can someone help me?" no one comes to help but first. But soon, 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, come and hold the box firmly on the stool while Mr. Summers mixes the papers that are inside. The original paraphernalia for the lottery was lost a long time ago. The black box that is on the stool now was first used before Old Man Warner was born, and he is the oldest man in town. Mr. Summers speaks frequently to the villagers and says he wants to build a new box, but no one wants to interfere in the important tradition that the black box represents. There is a story that says that the current box was made with some pieces of the box that was used before it. That box was constructed when the first people started the village here long ago. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers begins talking again about making a new box, but as the year goes on, people start to talk less and less about the subject, and they do nothing about the box. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, hold the black box firmly on the stool until Mr. Summers finishes mixing the papers with his hand. Because the villagers have forgotten so many of the rituals, Mr. Summers was able to substitute pieces of paper for the pieces of wood that were used for generations before. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves prepare the pieces of paper and put them in the box. Then they put the box in Mr. Summers' safe at the coal company. It stays there until Mr. Summers is ready to take it to the square the next morning. During the rest of the year, they leave the box in one place or another. Once it stayed in Mr. Graves' barn, and another year it was used as a table in the post office. Sometimes it was placed on a shelf in Mr. Martin's grocery store. There are many things to do before Mr. Summers can begin the lottery. He needs to prepare the lists, the list of the heads of families, the list of the heads of each house in each family, and the list of the members of each house in each family. Mr. Graves, the postmaster, also needs to correctly introduce Mr. Summers as the official of the lottery. Few people in the town remember that at some time in the past, the official of the lottery performed a recital of some kind. It was a very short, unmusical recitation that was said obediently every year. Some people believe that the official used to stand in a very specific way when he said or sang the recitation. Other people believe that the official was supposed to walk through the crowd of people, but many, many years ago, people stopped performing these elements of the ritual. There was also a ritual salute that the official of the lottery had to use to greet each person who approached to draw from the box. To draw means to choose or to remove in this context, but this has also changed over the years. Until now, people think it is only necessary for the official to talk to each person who comes up to the box. Mr. Summers is very good at all of this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, and with one hand naturally resting on the black box, he seems very proper and important as he talks interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally stops talking and turns to all the people of the village, Mrs. Hutchinson comes quickly along the path to the square. She finds a place in the back of the group of people. "I completely forgot what day it was," she says to Mrs. Delacroix, who is standing next to her. They both laugh softly. "I thought my husband was in the yard cutting wood," Mrs. Hutchinson continues. "And then I looked out the window, and my children weren't there. And then I remembered that today was the 27th, and I came as quickly as I could." She dries her hands on her kitchen apron, and Mrs. Delacroix says, "You arrived in time, though. They're still talking over there at the box." Mrs. Hutchinson raises her head to look over the crowd and finds her husband and children standing near the front. She touches Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a goodbye and begins to move through the crowd. The people separate good-humoredly to allow her to pass. 2 or 3 people say in voices just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Here comes your wife, Hutchinson." And, "Bill, she's finally here." Mrs. Hutchinson reaches her husband, and Mr. Summers, who was waiting, says happily, "I thought we were going to have to start without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson says, smiling, "You wouldn't make me leave my dishes in the sink without drying them, would you, Joe?" And the people in the crowd laugh softly as they move back into their positions after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Okay now," Mr. Summers says, "seriously, I think we should begin. Let's finish this as quickly as we can so we can all go back to work. Is there anyone who is not here?" "Dunbar," several people say. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers looks at his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he says. "That's right. He broke his leg, didn't he? Who's choosing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman says. Mr. Summers turns to look at her. "A wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers says. "Don't you have a grown boy who could do it for you, Janie?" Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village know the answer perfectly well. But it is the job of the official of the lottery to ask questions like that formally. Mr. Summers waits politely as Mrs. Dunbar answers. My son Horace is still only 16, Mrs. Dunbar says with remorse. I guess I have to take my husband's place this year. All right, Mr. Summers says. He writes something on the list he is holding. Then he asks, Is the Watson boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raises his hand. I'm here, he says. I'm drawing for my mother and me. He stands there nervously and puts his head down as some people in the crowd say things like, You're a good kid, Jack, and I'm glad to see your mother has a man to choose for her. Well, Mr. Summers says, I guess that's everyone. Is old man Warner here? Here, a voice says, and Mr. Summers nods his head up and down. The crowd suddenly becomes quiet as Mr. Summers clears his throat and looks at the list. Is everybody ready? He calls. Now, I'll read the names, the heads of all the families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand and don't look at it until everyone takes their turn. Do you all understand? The people have done this lottery so many times that they do not pay close attention to the directions anymore. Most of the people are quiet and do not look around at the other people in the crowd. Then Mr. Summers raises one hand up high and says, Adams. A man leaves the crowd and comes forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers says, and Mr. Adams says, Hi, Joe. They smile at each other soberly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reaches into the black box and takes out a folded piece of paper. He holds the paper firmly by one corner as he turns and goes back quickly to his place in the crowd. He holds the paper firmly by one corner as he turns and goes back quickly to his place in the crowd. He stands a little away from his family and does not look down at his hand. Allen, Mr. Summers says. Anderson. Bentham. It seems like there's no time between the lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix says to Mrs. Graves in the back of the crowd. It seems like we finished the last lottery only last week. Time really does pass quickly, Mrs. Graves says. Clark. Delacroix. There goes my husband, Mrs. Delacroix says. She does not breathe as her husband walks forward to the box. Dunbar, Mr. Summers says, and Mrs. Dunbar walks to the box while one of the women says, Go on, Janie, and another says, There she goes. We're next, Mrs. Graves says. She watches while Mr. Graves comes to the front of the box, says hello to Mr. Summers somberly, and selects a piece of paper from the box. By now, there are many men holding small pieces of folded paper in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stand together, with Mrs. Dunbar holding the piece of paper. Harbor. Hutchinson. Go on, Bill, Mrs. Hutchinson says, and the people near her laugh. Jones. Some people say, Mr. Adams says to old man Warner, who is standing next to him, that in the village to the north they're thinking about not doing the lottery anymore. Old man Warner grunts. They're a pack of crazy fools, he says. They're crazy because they're listening to the young people. Nothing is good enough for the young people. The next thing you know, they'll want to live in caves again, with nobody working anymore. Try and live like that for a while. There used to be a saying, with the lottery in June, the corn will grow strong soon. If we stop the lottery, all of us will be eating weeds and nuts. We have always had a lottery, he says angrily. I think it's already bad to see that young Joe Summers is making jokes with everybody who goes to the box. Some places don't have the lotteries at all anymore, Mr. Adams says. That'll only cause trouble, old man Warner says firmly. They're a pack of young fools. Martin, and little Bobby Martin watches as his father goes forward. Overdike. Percy. I wish they would go faster, Mrs. Dunbar says to her older son. I wish they would hurry. They're almost finished, her son says. You get ready to run and tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar says. Mr. Summers calls his own name and then steps forward precisely and selects a piece of paper from the box. Then he calls, Warner. This is the 77th year I'll be in the lottery, Old Man Warner says as he goes through the crowd. 77th time. Watson. The tall boy comes through the crowd self-consciously. Someone says, Don't be nervous, Jack. And Mr. Summers says, Take your time, son. Zanini. After that, there is a long pause where nobody breathes, until Mr. Summers, holding his piece of paper in the air, says, All right, everybody. For a minute, no one moves, and then all the men open their folded pieces of paper. Suddenly, all the women begin to talk at the same time, saying, Who is it? Who has it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? Then the voices begin to say, It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson has it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar says to her older son. People begin to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson is standing quiet, looking down at the piece of paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouts at Mr. Summers. You didn't give him enough time to take the paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Don't complain, Tessie, Mrs. Delacroix says, and Mrs. Graves says, All of us took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, Bill Hutchinson says. Well, everyone, Mr. Summers says, we did that pretty quickly, and now we need to hurry a little more to finish in time. He consults his next list. Bill, he says, you draw for the Hutchinson family. Do you have any other houses in the Hutchinson family? There's Don and Eva, Mrs. Hutchinson yells. Make them take their chance. Daughters draw with the family of their husbands, Tessie, Mr. Summers says gently. You know that as well as anyone else. It wasn't fair, Tessie says. I guess not, Joe, Bill Hutchinson says with remorse. My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's fair, and I don't have any other family except my kids. So, the person who draws as the head of the family, that is you, Mr. Summers explains. And the person who will draw for each house in the family, that is you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson says. How many kids do you have, Bill? Mr. Summers asks formally. 3, Bill Hutchinson says. There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me. All right then, Mr. Summers says. Harry, did you get their pieces of paper back? Mr. Graves nods and holds up the pieces of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers says. Take Bill's paper and put it in. I think we should start over, Mrs. Hutchinson says, as quietly as she can. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves selects the 5 pieces of paper and puts them in the box, and he throws all the other pieces of paper onto the ground, where the breeze lifts them away. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson says to the people around her. Are you ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asks, and Bill Hutchinson looks quickly at his wife and children and nods his head up and down yes. Remember, Mr. Summers says, take the pieces of paper and keep them folded until each person has one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves takes the hand of the little boy who comes with him happily up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers says. Davy puts his hand into the box and laughs. Take just one paper, Mr. Summers says. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves takes the child's hand and removes the folded paper from it and holds it while little Dave stands next to him and looks up at him in admiration. Nancy is next, Mr. Summers says. Nancy is 12 and her friends from school are very nervous as she goes forward, Moving her skirt back and forth, she takes a piece of paper delicately from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers says, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, almost knocks over the box as he is trying to get the paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers says. She hesitates for a minute. She looks around her defiantly, and then with a severe look on her face, she goes up to the box. She quickly takes a piece of paper out and holds it behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers says, and Bill Hutchinson reaches into the box and feels around. He finally brings out his hand with a piece of paper in it. The crowd is quiet. A girl whispers, "I hope it's not Nancy," and everyone hears the sound of the whisper. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner says clearly. "People aren't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers says. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opens the piece of paper, and the people in the crowd begin to talk quietly as he holds up the paper, and everyone can see that there is nothing on it. The paper is blank. Nancy and Bill, Jr., open theirs at the same time, and both are excited and they laugh. They turn around to the crowd and hold their pieces of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers says. There is a pause, and then Mr. Summers looks at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolds his paper and shows it. It is blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers says, and his voice is quiet. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson goes over to his wife and forces the piece of paper out of her hand. It has a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers made the night before with the dark pencil in his office in the coal company. Bill Hutchinson holds it up, and the people in the crowd begin to move. "All right, everyone," Mr. Summers says. "Let's finish quickly." The people of the town forgot the details of the ritual, and they lost the original black box, but they still remember to use stones. The pile of stones the boys made earlier is ready. There are stones on the ground with the pieces of paper that came out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selects a stone so large she has to pick it up with both hands, and she turns to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she says. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar has small stones in both hands, and she says, having difficulty breathing, "I can't run fast at all. You will have to go ahead of me and I'll catch up with you." The children have stones already, and someone gives little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson is in the center of the square now, and she holds her hands out in front of her desperately as the people of the town move in closer, all around her. "It isn't fair," she says. A stone hits her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner is saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams is in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves next to him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screams, and then the people strike. At the end.
The Lottery. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square, between the post office and the bank, around 10 o'clock. In some towns there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced this name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box. But every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything's being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny. But now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves's barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up, of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster, as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people. But years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time, until now it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking wood," Mrs. Hutchinson went on. "And then I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes you, Mrs. Hutchinson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well, now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with, so's we can go back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar! Dunbar!" Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janey?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, "Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Here," he said. "I'm drawing for my mother and me." He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, "Good fellow, Jack. and "Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it." "Well," Mr. Summers said, "guess that's everyone. Old Man Warner make it?" "Here," a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now, I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams." A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said. "Anderson. Bentham." "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries any more," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. "Seems like we've got through with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves said. "Clark. Delacroix." "There goes my old man," Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. "Dunbar," Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, "Go on, Janey," and another said, "There she goes." "We're next," Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. "Harbert, Hutchinson." "Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones." "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old Man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said, "listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work any more. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." "Some places have already quit lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," Old Man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." "Martin," and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. "Overdyke. Percy." "I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "You get ready to run tell Dad," Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name, and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner." "77th year I been in the lottery," Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. "77th time." "Watson." The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack." And Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." "Zanini." After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family, that's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids." "Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too. Right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3, Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me." "All right, then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box, then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said as quietly as she could. "I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that." Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. "Listen, everybody," Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked. And Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it, while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12. and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.?" Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet over large, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. "Tessie?" Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. "Bill?" Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie?" Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair! It isn't right!" Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. And then they were upon her.